The locker was empty. Not cleaned out in the ordinary sense, not the routine end-of-season clearing that every player does when a year concludes and the building goes quiet for the winter. This was different. This was immediate. This was the specific, deliberate emptiness of a space that had been occupied by a presence so large that its absence felt physical, like air had been removed from the room along with everything else. The equipment. The personal items. The carefully arranged routine objects that elite athletes surround themselves with as anchors of preparation and focus. Gone. All of it. Cleared with a thoroughness that communicated intention rather than impulse. Shohei Ohtani's locker at Dodger Stadium was empty before sunrise. The defeat was still fresh. The stadium had not yet fully processed what the final score meant. The coaching staff was still inside the facility, conducting the kind of post-game review that follows a loss with implications as serious as this one carried. Players were still in various stages of the transition from competition back to reality, showers, conversations, the slow emotional descent from the intensity of a game that mattered. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, in the specific window between the final out and the moment the building began to empty, Ohtani had moved. Quietly. Completely. With a decisiveness that left no room for interpretation. He had cut off contact with the organization. He had emptied his locker. And by the time Los Angeles was fully dark, he was gone, disappeared into the night in a manner so clean and so total that the people who discovered the empty locker the next morning stood in front of it for a long moment before anyone said anything at all. Then the phone started ringing. And everything that had been building beneath the surface of this organization came rushing up at once. To understand why Ohtani left, you have to understand what the defeat actually meant, not just in the standings, not just in the statistical record, but in the specific human context of what had been happening inside this clubhouse for weeks. The loss itself was painful in the particular way that losses are painful when they feel avoidable. When the decisions made in the critical moments feel wrong in real time and feel worse in retrospect. When players on the field can see the path to a different outcome and watch it close, one choice at a time, until the final out makes the alternative irrelevant. Roberts had made decisions in that game that did not sit well inside the clubhouse. Lineup choices that players questioned privately. In-game management calls that the veterans, men who have been in these situations enough times to read them accurately, recognized as wrong while they were happening. And one decision in particular, involving Ohtani directly, that crossed from questionable into something that felt, to the players closest to the situation, like a statement rather than a strategy. The ruthless decision Roberts made regarding Ohtani in that game was not made in isolation. It was made in the context of weeks of tension, of accumulated grievances, of an internal dynamic that had been deteriorating with the specific slowness that makes organizational fractures so dangerous, invisible until they aren't, manageable until they suddenly, completely aren't. Ohtani absorbed the decision during the game. He performed. He competed. He did what he always does, took whatever situation he was placed in and responded with the professionalism that has defined every chapter of his career. But when the final out was recorded and the loss was official, something shifted. Something that had been held in place by the discipline of competition was released. And what Ohtani did next reflected a clarity of decision that suggested he had been thinking about it for longer than just that night. The details of how Ohtani moved are as significant as the fact that he moved at all. This was not an emotional exit. It was not the kind of dramatic departure that a player makes in the immediate heat of a moment, storming out, slamming doors, leaving behind the visible evidence of anger. Those exits communicate feeling. They are expressive. They invite response, negotiation, the possibility of a conversation that walks things back. Ohtani's exit communicated something different. It communicated finality. The locker was emptied with a care and completeness that required time and intention. Every item removed. Every personal effect accounted for. The space left not just vacant but clean, as though the goal was to leave no trace of unfinished business, no physical remnant that could serve as a pretext for re-engagement. The communication channels went silent simultaneously. Calls to Ohtani's phone, from coaches, from front office personnel, from teammates who had heard what was happening and needed to understand it, went unanswered. Messages sent into silence. The specific, total unavailability of a person who has made a decision and is not interested in having it undone by conversation. And then he was gone from the city entirely. Los Angeles, in the middle of the night, with its particular combination of size and anonymity, is a place where a person can disappear if they want to. Ohtani, who has navigated global celebrity with a privacy discipline that rivals anyone in professional sports, knows how to move without being tracked. By the time the sun came up and the empty locker was discovered, he was already somewhere else entirely. The organization was left holding questions that had no immediate answers. And inside that silence, the first person to speak publicly was the last person anyone expected to explode the way he did. Mookie Betts is not a player who loses control publicly. His reputation across years of professional baseball at the highest level is built on exactly the opposite quality, a composure under pressure that matches his physical talent, a professionalism in public settings that makes him one of the most respected voices in the sport. He does not say things he will regret. He does not use media platforms to settle internal disputes. He handles the difficult moments with the same controlled excellence that he brings to everything else. Which is precisely why the words hit so hard when they came. Roberts is crazy. Not qualified. Not softened with context or diplomatic language designed to give everyone involved a way to walk back from the edge. Direct. Unambiguous. Spoken with the specific emphasis of a man who had reached the limit of what professional obligation required him to contain. Betts was not speaking impulsively. Anyone who knows him understands that. He had watched what happened in that game. He had seen the decision Roberts made regarding Ohtani, the ruthless, inexplicable decision that players on both sides of the dugout had registered in real time as wrong. He had watched the aftermath unfold. And when the microphone was in front of him and the moment arrived, he chose truth over diplomacy. The statement detonated across every platform where baseball is discussed within minutes of being spoken. Because Betts carrying that message, Betts, of all people, using language that blunt about his own manager, communicated something to the baseball world that no analytical breakdown could have conveyed. This was not frustration. This was indictment. And Roberts, who had already been managing the aftermath of Ohtani's disappearance, now faced something significantly more complicated. A star player gone without explanation. A franchise cornerstone publicly calling his decision-making crazy. And a front office that was about to ask very hard questions about how a single night had produced consequences this severe. The decision Roberts made regarding Ohtani in that game has to be understood in its full context to appreciate why it produced the reaction it did. Managing Shohei Ohtani requires a calibration that no manager in baseball history has ever had to develop before. The decisions about when to protect him, when to deploy him, when to absorb a short-term competitive cost in service of his long-term availability, these are not decisions that conventional baseball wisdom provides a template for. Roberts has been navigating this reality since Ohtani arrived in Los Angeles, and he has made those navigations, on balance, reasonably well. But the decision in that game was different. It was not a calibration call. It was not a careful weighing of short-term and long-term considerations. It was a decision that, to the players watching it unfold in real time, looked like something other than baseball strategy. It looked like a statement. Like a message being sent through the medium of a lineup card and an in-game choice, a message directed at Ohtani specifically, carrying a subtext that the players in that dugout could read even if the press box could not. What made it ruthless was not its severity in isolation. It was the timing. The context. The fact that it came in a critical game, with stakes that everyone in that building understood, after weeks of internal friction that had been building toward exactly this kind of breaking point. Ohtani felt it. He knew what the decision meant. And when the game ended and the loss was official, he made his own decision, one that was, in its own way, equally ruthless. He removed himself from the equation entirely. Andrew Friedman's night did not involve sleep. The sequence of events that landed on his desk in the hours following the defeat represented the kind of multidimensional organizational crisis that even the most prepared executive is never fully ready for. An empty locker. A disappeared superstar. A star player's public condemnation of the manager. And underneath all of it, the ruthless decision that had set everything in motion. Friedman is a front office executive whose reputation is built on clarity, on the ability to process complex information quickly and make decisions that reflect organizational priorities without being distorted by the emotional temperature of the moment. That reputation was being tested in the most demanding way possible. The calls went out. To people who might know where Ohtani was. To members of the coaching staff who needed to understand that the public statements coming out of the clubhouse had consequences. To the manager himself, who needed to account for a decision that had produced an outcome nobody could defend as acceptable. None of those conversations were easy. None of them produced the kind of clean resolution that press releases are written around. They produced, instead, the beginning of a reckoning, a forced examination of whether the structure inside this organization, the decision-making process, the communication channels between the manager and his most important player, were functioning at the level a championship contender requires. The answer, based on everything that one night had revealed, was clearly no. Strip away the drama. Set aside the empty locker and the midnight departure and the phones ringing into silence. Get to the core of what Ohtani's disappearance actually communicates. It communicates that something happened inside this organization that crossed a line he had privately established. That the accumulation of decisions, statements, and internal dynamics had reached a threshold beyond which his standard response, composure, professionalism, silence, was no longer the response he was willing to give. Ohtani has never before, in his career in professional baseball, responded to organizational friction this way. He has managed difficult situations with a consistency that borders on superhuman. He has absorbed pressure, criticism, controversy, and complexity without altering the routine or the standard that defines him. The fact that this situation produced a different response is the most important data point in this entire story. It means that what Roberts did, the ruthless decision, the public subtext, the managerial statement delivered through a lineup card in a critical game, was not something that Ohtani's standard framework could process and release. It stayed. It accumulated on top of everything else that had been accumulating. And when the final out was recorded and the professional obligation of competition was lifted, it produced the only response Ohtani had left. Removal. Complete, deliberate, total removal. The locker is still empty. Los Angeles woke up to a story it didn't know how to hold, a superstar gone, a franchise cornerstone publicly condemning his manager, and a front office conducting a reckoning that nobody wanted to be necessary. Roberts made a ruthless decision. Ohtani responded with one of his own. And Betts said, out loud and on the record, what the entire clubhouse had been thinking. 3 words. No qualifications. No diplomatic cushioning. Roberts is crazy. Whether that assessment costs Roberts his position, whether it forces a structural recalibration of how this organization is managed, whether Ohtani's disappearance becomes permanent or temporary, all of that will play out in the days and weeks ahead. But the empty locker will not be forgotten. Because empty lockers in professional sports are never just about objects removed from a shelf. They are about a decision made in the dark, in the middle of a night, by a player who decided that what had been asked of him was no longer something he was willing to give. Shohei Ohtani left Los Angeles without a word. Sometimes silence is the loudest thing in the room.